Oh, well, hello there. Welcome back to Introduction to Cultural Anthropology. Today we're going to be talking about doing field work and ethnographies, primarily focusing on some pretty basic techniques to doing field work, some of the stuff that you guys are going to be needing to do for your final project. So we'll kind of dive into all the different things that you need to be concerned with to do proper field work, what it takes, some of the history behind it, some of the stuff that you can do today. We'll talk a little bit about some of the conflicts that come up when conducting field work. Field work in itself, I think, is the best part of doing cultural anthropology. It allows us to really learn about other cultures and who they are, and it helps us as well, not only as anthropologists but as individuals. So we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. Okay. So why do we use ethnographic fieldwork in our research? It's a methodology that allows us to focus on people, on and doing it in a way that is ethical. Okay, and this becomes really important to understand. Because we're dealing with people, we need to make sure that their agency, their individuality, their identity isn't compromised in any way, right? We want to make sure that we get an authentic telling of who they are, and that's really important. And you know, we might idealize certain aspects of culture that we think are more important than others. There might be things that we learn that we don't like about a particular culture, but it's still a part of it. And so that kind of thing needs to be represented. So we have to make sure that we bring it all in. To do this, as researchers, we oftentimes live within the community that we're working with. Whether it's a foreign community outside of the country, or even local communities, even doing stuff like corporate entities. If you're working for a corporation, a business, you would essentially live and work a lot like a lot of the people that you're going to be studying, so that you can gain a better understanding of what it's like to live in their shoes. So you would do that whether or not you were going overseas and living in a remote village somewhere, or in a cosmopolitan area, or in a corporate office, right? All of these things are essentially the same in how we would proceed in doing this kind of research. And granted, not everything is ever going to be the same, but there are some procedures that we generally try and follow, and we'll talk about those. The important aspect here is that we learn about their culture from their eyes, right? That we gain their perception, we walk in their shoes, we learn to understand what it's like to be them, right? And that allows us to really dive deep into that culture and to better understand it. So a lot of times, when we're learning and studying about anthropology, it's through the classroom, it's through textbooks. And this is the part where you actually go out and do it, when you're doing anthropology. And it becomes an integral part of our process. So going out, doing the field work, talking to people, mapping, learning about the environment, all of those things are really important to understand as far as a community goes, and how they live in that community. It also allows us to verify or check previous work that's been done, right? oftentimes we come across in our own research, right? We're reading about this culture, we're reading about this community, but say that textbook is 20 or 30 or 40 years old or older, the identity of that culture may and probably has changed since that initial book was written. And so it allows us to go back and look at that culture and compare what's changed. And then also realizing that a lot of times when we're doing field work, and this is something that's really important to understand as well, is that you're only capable of getting so much when you're doing field work. You can't live with everybody. You can't work with everybody. You're only going to be getting glimpses from the people that you interact with. And so, you know, say you live in a community where there's 3,000 people. Well, you're probably not going to get all 3,000. But you might get 30 or 40 people. And then you can use that as a means to sort of like, well, based off of this, we're going to be doing our best work to create a theory that fits all of these people, even though there are going to be things that are going to be missed. We understand that, right? And any time that we take any history from an older ethnographic book or anything like that, we can say that, okay, not everything was going to be like that in that time, right? That previous researcher probably didn't get a chance to speak to everybody that they wanted to. And that's just reality, right? We can get to as much as we possibly can to create the greatest image and understanding as we can, but nothing will ever be perfect, right? And in 10 or 20 years, that culture might have changed drastically so that your research will show a different time. And that's kind of what a lot of field research is we're taking snapshots of a community at a given time. And things might change greatly, they might not. We never know until we actually go forth and to the future and see what happens, right? And then have something to compare it against. We also look at, again, that process, the theoretical knowledge, the things that we learned in those books, and then that practical knowledge of actually being there and working within that community. And a lot of this can change depending on who you are as a researcher. It can depend on everything from your race to your gender, right? All of these things can impact how people are going to interact with you. Now, we like to think that that isn't always the case, that it's going to be based on things like merit, right? I'm a researcher, I'm going to be biased, but not everybody sees you as that, right? You might think of yourself as like, I am going to be unbiased and you know, I can do this work on my own without having any of those issues. The problem is that not everybody is like that, right? Not everybody has the same perspective that you might. So when you go into that community, how you look, how you behave, how you speak, the languages that you know, all of those things can have an impact on your research, right? Their perception of you. Now, given enough time and enough interaction, those can change, right? Those perceptions or preconceived ideas can be challenged, and they might have a new idea, a new process to associate with you as an individual versus the preconceived idea of your race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, education level, all of those things, right? So that is just one of those things that we have to take into account. Through field work, we also learn empathy. That's really important to understand, is that we try and understand what it's like to be like them, to live like them, to understand what it's like to feel and experience their lives. What is it like when someone dies? What is it like when somebody is celebrating a victory or some sort of a commencement or ceremony? How does that look? How does that feel? What do they get from it? You know, so we try and learn empathy for the folks that we're working with, and that gives us a greater understanding of what it means to be a member of that community. Through this process of doing field work, we also create bonds, right? Friendships, relationships, and that is kind of a big part. Everywhere that I've gone, everywhere that I've worked personally, you make acquaintances, you make friends, depending on the culture that you're working in, the people that you're working with, how close you work to them, right? It's kind of like just a normal everyday job too, right? You meet people, you work with them, and they become a part of your life. So you're going to do that with this as well, right? Your friends, your coworkers, all of them are going to have an impact on your life, and you're going to have an impact on them. And that is also something that has to be taken into consideration, is that you will influence the people that you will be working with. That's inescapable. That's just how humans operate. Okay, so doing field work. One of the things that oftentimes happens when you're going out into the field and you're working with another community, you're not just learning about their community, but you're also learning about your own culture. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that you're going to be comparing, right? To understand somebody else, you have to have that base knowledge. And that's why it's important to understand the culture that you're coming from, its values, what you believe in, what religious practices you might have experienced. All of those things become really important to understand what people are going to do next, right? And why they might do it. And if you can understand yourself, and then have something to compare it against, so that you can have something to draw upon, right? It helps. One of the things that we certainly benefit is this ability to gain perspective about this other culture that you're working in, and also it helps us to, through that perspective, eliminate ethnocentrism, right? And ethnocentrism is this idea that your culture is the best or does something in the best way. And understanding that not everything is going to, be the same when you go to another culture, and they might do things differently, and they might seem weird or confusing to you or whatever. Well, that's understandable, right? But when we do this, and again, gaining that empathy for that other community, right, we can eliminate that sense of ethnocentrism and try and understand that community for who they actually are, for who they believe they are, for the things that they find important. We can learn from that and engage in that community and better understand it. Okay, so one of the things that conducting field work often entails, and this is something that's kind of important to understand, right? We are a science, right? We have a particular way of doing things. There's ways to go out and conduct interviews and to assess a community and access that information. And that's the science part of it, right? gaining that information, understanding it, putting it into perspective. But fieldwork is a combination of art and science. And by art, I mean it is your interaction, your work towards it, how you engage in it, right? The process of understanding culture, right? I will become a participant observer. And through that process, I will learn about that community. But how I go about doing it, that's the art of it. That's the, am I friendly enough? Am I engaging enough? How do I use humor? How do I use my credentials? How do I engage in traditional gender roles? Right? All of these things can be a part of the art of doing that science, because different people are going to get different responses, whenever they're doing research. And that's one of the interesting things about this type of research, right? If we're talking about doing chemistry, right? Chemistry doesn't care what your age, your race, your gender, you pour in substances and then things bubble or they explode or whatever, right? This isn't that science. This is a science that is very complicated and has different relationships with the people, right? Because people are so very complex. Where you're coming from can make a difference. And so understanding that and using that to your advantage, using that to understand how people are going to react to you, right, can give you an idea of what kind of information you can expect to learn. Another aspect, one that I'm very familiar with, is this aspect of culture shock. Now, in culture shock, essentially what we are experiencing is, say you go to a community, right, and you've never been there before, and I'll give you an example. So when I first went to go work on the Ute Mountain Reservation, and this was a field school that I was working in. As a student, we go down, we set up camp in this beautiful location in the Mancos Canyon in southwestern Colorado. And we get down there, we set up, we start talking about what we're going to try and accomplish, and we've done a lot of research and a lot of reading on these communities that we're going to be working in. But then the first day when we are supposed to go in and work, right, I was nervous. I was, I didn't know what to expect. How do you interact with these folks? It's a different culture. How do you show respect? How do you engage in conversation, and how do you, try and go there and not screw things up, basically. And those are difficult questions to answer, right? We don't always have a right answer for that, and a lot of it just comes down to experience. Every year that I've gone down and worked in that community, I've experienced a little bit of culture shock. And it's just living in a different environment, listening to a different language. Even though it's most of the time folks are speaking English, it's not the same that I grew up with, right? There's a different way of speaking. There are different things that are important within that language that I don't understand. And so that those language barriers can be difficult. So it can be distracting, it can be disorienting, and that's normal. That's just normal. And so you learn to deal with it. You learn to say, okay, that was a problem. I learned a lesson, and you don't let those negative things, drag on. You learn from those things and you keep moving forward. There's also this thing called reverse culture shock. And reverse culture shock is where you return home from doing field work. And I've experienced that as well. The program that I was involved with at the Ute Mountain Reservation, we would go down and camp for 2 months in this wonderful canyon. No running water, no electricity, no cell phone service. When we would go into Toyac, we would gain access to those things, but at our camp, we were pretty isolated. During that process, you end up meeting the people that you're working with, you develop friendships, and you see a different lifestyle, right? You know, as soon as it got dark, you know, I stay up late at night every night till midnight, 1 o'clock in the morning. That's normal. Out there, my clock's changed. It got to be 9:30, and I'm like, you know what? I'm going to bed. It's dark. Time for me to go to bed. I don't have the same sort of electronic light that's keeping me up. I don't have the things that I would normally do that would keep me up. So it changes. And then you learn to condition yourself to that. And then it becomes normal that you go to bed at 9 o'clock, that, you know, dinner is a certain time and you have a bunch of people around, and then you return home. And home looks very different from the way it did before. And you sometimes go into shock, you know, that you get emotional, or you get to experience, you know, anxiety. And I went out with some friends after I got back. I'd been back for, I think, like 2 or 3 days. Went to a bar with some friends, and they were sitting there talking about their designer jeans. And I had just come back, you know, living in dirt tents, not dirt tents, tents in the middle of a canyon covered in dirt, doing this great work, and, you know, designer jeans never came up, right? And it was the trappings of a different culture. It was the things that certain people are interested in that I had lost. I had lost those things, and it was difficult for me to reintegrate into normal culture. And within a few weeks, it was easy to adapt back to that normal life. But you can experience that culture shock, not only going someplace, but also returning home. Okay, so what I want you to do right now is I want you to think about, if you were going to do a project, if you were going to go to another culture and you wanted to learn about them, what would you need? What are some of the things that you would need to prepare for? What are some of the things that you would want as far as like tools are concerned? So I want you to take a couple of minutes and write down a couple of ideas. What are some things that you would like to learn about? What are some things that you would like to take with you that you think would be necessary? What would you need to do to prepare, right? People to contact, equipment, those sort of things. So take a couple minutes, pause, write something down, and then we'll jump back into it. You still there? Okay, yes. All right, so what did you come up with? Let's talk about a few things. So to prepare, some of the stuff that we would do to prepare. Literature review. Who's already gone out there and done stuff, right? Who's published? Who's written a book? Has anyone done a documentary, right? So we would go and we would review all of that research that's been done. We would also consider looking at research for local neighbors, right? If I'm going to go down and work at the Ute Mountain Reservation, they're not isolated. They interact with the Navajo. They interact with the city of Cortez. Each one of these has a different ethnic identity and a different history, right? They're going to perceive their history differently than what the Ute are going to say that their history is. So doing research on those communities might give you an idea about how they view the community that you're going to be working with. And it can give you more of a perspective of how they see themselves, that the Ute people see themselves, and how their neighbors see them. And they can be different, right? They can definitely be different. So it gives us a better understanding of everybody, right? Learning the language. Language, again, one of the most fundamental aspects of understanding a culture is understanding the language that you're working in. Whether it is, say, the Ute Mountain language, Weemanooch, which is the name of the band of people, and they speak Uto-Aztecan. Well, Uto-Aztecan, Ute, Aztec, you're going to see a connection there. So those things can be really important to gain an identity. Again, language is is how we understand the world, right? Through our ability to describe it, right? So it becomes really important. So, right, learn the language. And that's not just for other languages, other cultures, but say I wanted to research gamers, and I wanted to understand what a gamer community was like. Well, I would need to learn the lingo for gamers. What are they saying? Because they're not using a lot of the same words that I might use normally outside and in everyday life. No, there's unique words that are associated with the types of games that they play and the community that they have, either online or individually. So learning the language becomes really important. Contacting other researchers that have worked in that area, who have published in that area, find out what they know. And especially, it's important that if you're going to go someplace and do this study, you're doing that literature review. Well, a lot of those researchers are still alive, right? So email them. Say, hey, I'm about to go do some research. What have you got for me? Do you have anything new? Anything that's changed? What do you know? Anyone to contact, right? Who were your resources? What did you think? And you can use that information that you gain from those other researchers to help you get along, to get you, moving forward and possibly getting contacts and getting information that maybe they didn't include in their literature. Maybe get personal views instead of the stuff that they actually wrote, which can be different. Contacting local or national government, right? So as researchers, when I was working on Ute Mountain, here's the thing: you can't just go walking and start studying people. That is really rare. You have to have typically some sort of permission to do so. Oftentimes it's on the national level or the state level. For us working on Ute Mountain, it was the tribal government, right? We would go to them because they are technically a sovereign nation within the state of Colorado. So I would go to them and I'd say, okay, I've got this idea. I want to do research. I want to work with you guys to help better your community, and then also so that I can learn from it and we can share that knowledge. They have to agree, right? You have to get permission to do that kind of stuff. Some countries that have native populations, if you go to South America, there might not always be the same sort of protections in place that we have in the United States when it comes to working with people. And that's not entirely accurate, but in these cases, you might just need to get either national or state level permission to go in and get that information and find out what is legal, what isn't legal. Make sure that you're understanding that there are rules that you have to follow, and what are those rules. And a lot of times you can also find contacts by going to those agencies and figuring out, oh, this is our contact with this tribe or this group of people. Contact this person and they can be your contact for moving forward. So, and sometimes you have to get permission to just come into the country, right? What is your purpose for being here? They would want to know. Contacting community leaders, who are the people in charge? And here's the thing, when it comes to like community leaders, we oftentimes sort of default towards politics. Who's the mayor of the town or city council or something like that. Community leaders don't always include those particular positions. You might look for a religious leader. You might look for, let's say I'm studying fishing practices in small villages. Well, the community leader there might be the best fisherman, right, or the oldest fisherman, and they can be the ones that are going to help you understand and who to talk to about a given subject, right? So finding those community leaders and gaining access to them will help you learn about all of this, right? And then doing like a early site visit oftentimes helps. Before you even start doing your research, before you get all the permissions that you need, go there and look around, see what people are doing. Think about some place that you might need to stay if you're leaving the United States, or if you're going to just another part of the state. Where are you going to live? How are you going to live? What kind of access to resources are you going to have? Maybe you can go out there and meet a few people and introduce yourself, right? So doing an early site visit becomes really important to just kind of prepare yourself for what you're going to do. You don't always get that opportunity, but if you can, I say take it. The toolkit, right? So these are the things that you want to bring with you. If we look at sort of classic anthropology, we are oftentimes looking at the stuff that they would use, and it was always analog, right? What that means is that they needed pen and paper or pencil and paper. They needed notebooks. When the camera became something of use, they would bring their cameras. But old school cameras, it's not like a digital camera today where you can take 1,000 photos. You might only bring enough equipment, enough resources to take like 25 to 30 pictures, and then that was it. That's all you had. So you had to be really thoughtful about the kinds of pictures that you were going to take. Right. Books, notebooks, anything else that was made out of paper, right? That was it. That's all you got. And it was your own notes, right? We take a look at today, what would you need? What do we have available to us, right? We've got cameras and video recorders, and I've got GPS, I've got drones, I've got all kinds of equipment that I can use to record everything. And that can also be an interesting issue to deal with. In some communities, they don't like to be recorded, right? Maybe you go in and you're like, hey, I want to listen to this ceremony that you guys are doing, and I'd like to record it. And they're like, no, you can't record this, right? This is sacred. And so you respect that. You don't record it, right? Even though it might seem beneficial to, even though you probably could get away with it. This is where those ethics comes in, right? If they don't want you to record it, you don't record it. But, you know, we still have those tools. And when we can use those tools, they become hugely advantageous. And it does so in a lot of different ways. One of the things about traditional anthropology and modern anthropology is that a lot of those early ethnographies were done through the eyes of the anthropologist and through their words. They had to write it down, they had to do the translating. Now we've got video cameras, so I can sit there and record someone's voice, someone's experience, and they can have their own representation, right? And that becomes really important. We'll talk a lot about that in a little bit. But understanding, allowing the folks that you're working with to represent themselves, okay? Okay, we're going to end it there, and then we'll jump into our topic of strategies, how to go out and actually do that research. Okay, we'll see you in a few.